This training includes on-screen sign language interpreting and captioning. Audio description is incorporated into the manner in which the training is presented.
Hi, my name is Juliet Schultz. I'm the Transportation Systems Engineer here at the Access Board, presenting a series of trainings on the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines. This specific training is on the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines PROAG, specifically a review of changes from the proposed rule to the final rule. I will be referring to the proposed rule as the NPRM, or Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. This training is not intended for those who are not familiar with the NPRM. I will make reference to the NPRM and how it has been modified. This training assumes that you're familiar with the NPRM and have some familiarity with the MUTCD provisions that we reference in the NPRM. If you are new to PROAG, we have a series of trainings on our YouTube channel that address chapter by chapter the provisions in the final rule. We also have a number of archived trainings on PROAG that were done in collaboration with the Great Lakes ADA Center. So in terms of changes, we are going to start off with advisory language. If you've looked at the final rule, you've probably noticed that we no longer include advisory language. And the reason is because advisory language is not enforceable. So it did provide guidance, we understand that, and instead of having the advisory language, what we will do is provide trainings like this, and we will develop training guidelines to help people in the implementation and understanding of the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines. So like I mentioned, we removed the advisories, and I'll talk to some of the places where we removed them. In some places, we completely got rid of the advisory language. In other cases, we didn't completely remove it. What we did is we instead made it a provision. So the first example here is in the NPRM, we had an advisory at R208.1. It discussed detectable warning surfaces at driveways and where you should consider providing detectable warning surfaces. We now, in the final rule, have a provision at R205.7 for detectable warning surfaces at driveways. So pedestrian circulation paths at driveways controlled with yield or stop control devices or traffic signals must have detectable warning surfaces. Another place where we had some discussion and advisory is the placement of detectable warning surfaces. So in the NPRM, we had an advisory at 305.2 on the placement of detectable warning surfaces. And we discussed that a concrete border, a 2-inch concrete border specifically, is allowed for the installation of detectable warning surfaces. In the final rule, we have included that advisory in a provision at 305.2 location, which reads in part, a concrete border not exceeding 2 inches shall be permitted on all sides of the detectable warning surface, except between the detectable warning surface and the edge of the pavement where a setback is already permitted. Now, what do we mean where a setback is already permitted? If you remember in the NPRM, a setback for the placement of detectable warning surface up to 5 feet from the back of curb was permitted depending on the location of the grade break at perpendicular curb ramps. That setback is still permitted, and the provision has been restructured for clarity at 305.2. So where you're allowed a 5-foot or 60-inch setback, the 2 inches for installation of the detectable warning surface is included in that 60 inches. So in other words, the maximum setback would be 60 inches, not 62 inches. We'll now talk about changes as it relates to the manual and uniform traffic control devices. As you may have noticed, we have removed all references to the manual and uniform traffic control devices. The pertinent sections have been directly included in the rule text. So you'll find some of the MUTCD text under headings of standard, guidance, and option. You'll find some of that included in the final rule to ensure greater access in the right-of-way. We also included applicable definitions from the MUTCD. We did deviate from MUTCD to provide greater access, and I'll talk about where we did that. So I'm going to also point out that I'm going to show 3 examples where we included MUTCD, either standard, guidance, or option language in the final rule text, but that is not an exhaustive list. It's just 3 examples. If I went through all the previously referenced language that is now incorporated, that could be a training in itself. The board will look to create a guidance document that compares the NPRM, previously referenced MUTCD language to the text in the final rule. You'll notice that requirements that we had referenced on APS, accessible pedestrian signals, are also now in the final rule, as well as requirements and technical specifications for alternate pedestrian access routes. Let's start with an example of MUTCD standard language that is now in the final rule. So MUTCD 6F63 standard, lines 4 and 5, which discuss the use of channelizing devices at alternate pedestrian access routes. They give you technical specifications in the standard in MUTCD, and what we have done is we have incorporated that in the final rule as provision R303.6, detectable edging of channelizing devices. So where channelizing devices used to delineate an alternate pedestrian access route, continuous detectable edging complying with R303.6 shall be provided throughout the length of the route. And then R303.6.1 as well as R303.6.2 are the technical specifications for that channelizing device, similar to MUTCD 6F.63. Let's look at another example of MUTCD guidance that is now in final rule. MUTCD 4E11 guidance, line 6, addresses pedestrian signal resting in walk and what the requirements are for the accessible walk indication. We have incorporated that as a provision at R306.3, accessible walk indication. We have a requirement for accessible walk indication, and this MUTCD language has been placed in the exception. So where the pedestrian signal rests in walk, the accessible walk indication may be limited to the first 7 seconds of the walk interval. If the pedestrian signal is resting in walk and there is sufficient time remaining to provide an accessible walk interval before the beginning of the pedestrian change interval, the accessible walk indication may be recalled by a button press. Another example of MUTCD guidance in the final rule is MUTCD 4E11, which is guidance on volume for audible walk indications. In the final rule, we have put that at provision R308.4 volume, and the requirements are the same as MUTCD. Now for an example of MUTCD option language in the final rule. MUTCD 4E13, accessible pedestrian signals and detectors, extended push button press, option, line 1. Pedestrians may be provided with additional features such as increased crossing time, audible beaconing, or a speech push button information message as a result of an extended push button press. That is now a provision which is at R307.3, extended push button press. I did mention that we deviated from MUTCD, specifically on MUTCD 4E.12, which is a standard requirement in MUTCD that states push button locator tones shall be deactivated when the traffic control signal is operating in flashing mode. We, in the final rule at 307.8.4, locator tone and traffic control signal in flashing mode, deviated from MUTCD in that we're requiring that the pedestrian push button locator tones remain active in flashing when the traffic control signal is operating in flashing mode. The pedestrian push button should activate a speech message that communicates the operating mode of the traffic control signal. And this is in the interest of providing effective communication. That's why on this specific MUTCD standard, we deviated. Next, we'll look at changes in application, administration, and scoping of PROAG. So the first is deviation from these standards. This section was previously titled Equivalent Facilitation, and it allowed that under the ADA, the use of alternative designs, products, or technologies that result in substantially equivalent or greater accessibility and usability than the proposed guidelines are permitted. In the final rule, the board clarified that the use of alternative designs, products, or technologies is not permitted for facilities subject to the ABA, the Architectural Barriers Act. So to address that, we added a provision at R102.2, explaining that under the ABA, deviations from an enforceable standard issued by GSA, HUD, DOD, or the USPS require an approved waiver or modification, which is issued by the standard setting agency upon determination that the waiver or modification is clearly necessary. So if you are covered under the ADAs, like Title II entities, there's really no change. But if you're covered under the ABA, there's a process for deviating from the requirements of these guidelines. The board has revised the definition of alteration, and the board has also provided a definition for developed, which is a word used in the definition for alteration. So an alteration is a change to or an addition of a pedestrian facility in an existing developed public right-of-way that affects or could affect pedestrian access, circulation, or usability. And developed is defined as containing buildings, pedestrian facilities, roadways, utilities, or elements. Taken together, the board expects full compliance with the requirements for new construction on undeveloped land, so greenfield essentially, while any construction undertaken in an existing developed right-of-way is expected to comply to the maximum extent feasible, where existing physical constraints make compliance with applicable requirements technically infeasible. In the final rule, you'll notice we replace the phrase maximum extent practicable with maximum extent feasible, which is consistent with the terminology used in the ABA and ADA accessibility guidelines. So on the screen, I'm showing NPRM provision R202.3.1, existing physical constraints, in comparison to final rule R202.3, existing physical constraints. So you see the change in make it impracticable to make compliance with applicable requirements technically infeasible. The other key change is the board eliminated right-of-way availability, which was used in the NPRM. We eliminated that as an example of an existing physical constraint. The board acknowledges that in many cases, regulated entities have authority to acquire additional right-of-way, which made it a confusing example of an existing physical constraint. DOJ and US DOT may provide information as to any expectations that entities acquire additional right-of-way to meet accessibility requirements. We also modified alterations as it pertains to accessible pedestrian signals. So in the NPRM, we had a provision at R209.2 alterations, which called for when you have existing pedestrian signals that whereby you alter the signal controller and software, that was an alteration that triggered accessibility requirements. The Access Board acknowledged the diverse nature of alterations that affect pedestrian signals, and we declined in the final guidelines to specify specific actions that trigger the requirement to install accessible pedestrian signals. Rather, pedestrian signals are subject to the same alteration requirements as other pedestrian facilities. So the entity making the alteration will assess according to requirements in the guidelines as adopted by the enforcing agencies, whether installation of an accessible pedestrian signal is required with specific alterations. The board notes that the enforcing agencies may provide further specifics in terms of what alterations would trigger installation of APS when they do their rulemaking in adopting these guidelines. And the final rule, transitional segment, is not a provision. So in the NPRM, we had a provision at R202.3.2 transitional segments. And what we did in the final rule is we define transitional segments. And that's basically the portion of a pedestrian circulation path that connects adjacent surfaces with different slopes or dimensions to provide a smooth transition. The application remains the same. We've just restructured it by, instead of making it a standalone provision, it's a defined term, and we use it where applicable through the rule test. Now we'll look at changes that pertain to pedestrian access routes and pedestrian circulation paths. For consistency with the ADA and ABA standards, which express slope only in ratios, in the final rule, slopes are expressed in both ratios and percentages. So what that looks like is slopes that were previously stated as 2% in the NPRM are now stated as 1 in 48 or 2.1%, which is the ratio that is used in ADA and ABA. The slope percentages are stated to 1 decimal place for ease of implementation, and also recognizing that current digital measuring tools commonly used in sidewalk construction typically provide measurements to 1 decimal place. For consistency, again, with the ADA and ABA standards, we changed the terminology that we used in the NPRM. So in the NPRM, you'll recall we used the term vertical surface discontinuities. We had that as a provision at R302.7.2. In final rule, we replaced that with changes in level. Again, that terminology, changes in level, is what's consistent in ADA with ADA and ABA. And that is at R302.6.2. The requirement itself has not changed. Protruding objects requirements in the NPRM are presented differently in the final rule, but the requirements remain the same. So in the NPRM at 210.2, we had a provision, pedestrian circulation paths other than shared use paths, and it spoke of objects overhanging any portion of a pedestrian circulation path and needed to comply with R402. In the final rule, we have a scoping provision at R207.1, which requires that protruding objects and vertical clearance along any portion of a pedestrian circulation path comply with R402. And at R402.5, we address the not reducing the required clear width. So protruding objects cannot reduce the clear width required for pedestrian access routes. Again, this requirement remains the same, it's just structured differently. Similarly, the requirement for vertical clearance has been revised, but the intent is still the same, and vertical clearance requirements apply to the entire width of the pedestrian circulation path, not just the pedestrian access route. In final rule, we have the vertical clearance at R402.4. Let's look at revisions to alternate pedestrian access routes next. We added a provision for alternate pedestrian access routes in the scoping chapter, and it points to the technical requirements that are in line with what was referenced in the MUTCD. So provision R204.1, alternate pedestrian access routes, requires that when a pedestrian circulation path is temporarily not accessible due to construction, maintenance operations, closure, or other similar conditions, an alternate pedestrian access route must be provided and comply with both R303 and R402. There is an exception if establishing or maintaining an alternate pedestrian access route is technically infeasible due to site conditions or existing physical constraints. An alternate means of providing access for pedestrians with disabilities is permitted. In sections 303 and 402, those are technical sections. So in 303, the board has specified the required accessibility features of an alternate pedestrian access route to ensure that they are detectable and contain the basic accessibility features of the closed route without being overly burdensome. And R402 addresses vertical clearance, which that applies to the entire pedestrian circulation path. We have a provision for signs in the final rule, and this is specifically signs that are used in alternate pedestrian access routes. So at R303.2 signs, we say that signs identifying alternate pedestrian access routes must be provided in advance of decision-making points. And we also have the requirement, and this again, we're looking at alternate pedestrian access route signage, proximity actuated audible signs or other non-visual means within the public right-of-way of conveying the information that identifies the alternate pedestrian access route must also be provided. The signs are intended to provide clarity to pedestrians with low vision or who are blind, information as to where the alternate pedestrian access route is located. Pedestrian push buttons or passive detection devices are required to be accessible even when used in temporary pedestrian signals on alternate pedestrian access routes. And that is explained in provision R303.7, pedestrian signal heads, where temporary pedestrian signal heads are provided at a crosswalk that is part of an alternate pedestrian access route. Pedestrian push buttons or passive detection devices shall be provided and comply with R307. And R307 gives you your technical requirements. Next, we'll talk about revisions in the sections pertaining to curb ramps, blended transitions, and crosswalks. In the NPRM, blended transitions, curb ramps, and ramps were defined in part by their technical specification, and that caused a lot of confusion. We also found through technical assistance inquiries that some users were confusing curb ramps with ramps. So it clarified that those are distinct elements with unique requirements. The 15-foot rule, again, if you're familiar with the NPRM, it permitted the curb ramp grade to exceed 15 feet, is now stated as an exception to the running slope provisions at R3042.1 and R304.3.1. Turning space is now referred to as landing. The landing terminology is consistent with ADA and ABA standards. There are some changes to the landing requirements from the NPRM. We've removed the requirement that a turning space at a perpendicular curb ramp constrained at the back of sidewalk needed to be 4 feet by 5 feet wide minimum. And that was at NPRM R304.2.1. We've also removed the requirement that a turning space at a parallel curb ramp constrained on 2 or more sides needed to be 4 feet by 5 feet wide minimum. And that was at NPRM R304.3.1. We have clarified when a landing is required at perpendicular curb ramps, and specifically where there's the option to change direction of travel at the top of perpendicular curb ramp as pictured. A turning space, or landing as we refer to it now, is required. The landing must be at least 4 feet by 4 feet unless it's at a shared use path. At a shared use path, the landing must be as wide as the shared use path. The slopes of the landing depend on whether the landing serves 1 or 2 curb ramps. And it's also dependent on the cross slope of the crosswalk as specified in the final rule at R302.5. So again, the main key here, the main key to notice the change that we made is a landing at a perpendicular curb ramp is only required when there is a change of direction. In the final rule, we revised the clear space requirements. In the NPRM, the clear space is what we referred to in the NPRM, but we've now changed that terminology slightly, and it's referred to as clear area. The dimensions remain the same, minimum 4 feet by 4 feet, but a clear space is, or a clear area, as we're now referring it to, is only required at perpendicular curb ramps. So at provision R304.2.4, clear area, 48-inch by 48-inch long minimum clear area is required beyond the bottom grade break of the perpendicular curb ramp run. And it must be within the width of the crosswalk. Again, at shared use paths, it needs to be as wide as the shared use path. The running slope is 5% maximum. The cross slope is dependent on where this perpendicular curb ramp is located. And so you would reference R302.5. So if it's at mid-block, then you can follow the grade of the road. If it's at a stop controlled intersection, you're looking at 2% max cross slope. And if it's a signalized, then you're looking at a 5% maximum cross slope. In the NPRM, we had this requirement under common requirements for curb ramps and blended transitions. So again, the clear area is only required at perpendicular curb ramps. The bypass requirement, this is a new provision in the final rule, but it was implied in the proposed rule, and it's now more explicitly stated. So you can see in this illustration, and this illustration is from the NPRM. This area in red, which is basically beyond the blended transition, allows for a pedestrian who's not crossing the street to be able to go around the corner using an accessible route. And so the way the provision is structured, and the provision is at R304.4.3 bypass, where blended transition serving more than one pedestrian circulation path has a running slope greater than 2.1%, a pedestrian access route must be provided so that a pedestrian not crossing the street may bypass the blended transition. The change of grade requirement is more clearly articulated in the final rule. And on the slide, you may have seen this illustration in previous trainings on the NPRM. It shows the difficulty a person using a manual wheelchair specifically may have when they're traversing adjacent steep grades. And so in previous trainings, you've probably heard us explain that if you have a curb ramp that is at the maximum allowable grade, which is 8.3%, and you have the crosswalk grade at the maximum allowable 5%, if what you're going to look at when we talk about change of grade is adding those two grades. So if the change, we don't want those two grades to exceed 13.3%. Where you have that, that's when you have a user in a manual wheelchair having difficulty going either from the crosswalk to the curb ramp or vice versa. So provision 304.5.2 change of grade talks about two options where you have that situation where your change of grade is exceeding 13.3. So at gutters and streets where change of grade occurs adjacent to curb ramps and blended transition, the change of grade must comply with either A, which is shown in the slide, the change of grade cannot exceed 13.3%, or option B on this slide, a transitional space must be provided at the bottom of the running slope of the curb ramp run or blended transition. That transitional space must extend at least 2 feet in the direction of pedestrian travel and for the full width of the curb ramp run or blended transition. The maximum running slope for that transition space is 2.1%. Again, that allows for adjusting from an 8.3 or greater curb ramp grade to the grade of the crosswalk or vice versa. And so that is now explicitly stated in final rule, even though we've talked about it over the years in our trainings. Curb ramps are required at each crosswalk. So in the final rule at R203.6.1.1, crosswalks at an intersection, what we require is one curb ramp or blended transition be provided for each crosswalk or a single blended transition that spans all crosswalks at the intersection corner. Except in alterations, we do have an exception for alterations. At mid-block or roundabout crosswalks, curb ramps or blended transitions must be provided on both ends of the crosswalk. Now, there are provisions that we've added where you have crosswalks at intersections where pedestrian crossing is prohibited. So you'll find that in the same provision, R203.6.1.1, crosswalks at an intersection. So it requires that curb ramps or blended transitions should not be provided, and the pedestrian circulation path must either be A, separated from the roadway with landscaping or other non-prepared surface, or B, separated from the roadway by a detectable vertical edge treatment with the bottom edge 15 inches maximum above the pedestrian circulation path. So again, we're requiring curb ramps at either end of a crosswalk. But if you have a crosswalk where pedestrian crossing is prohibited, this is what PROAG requires you to do when this crosswalk is at an intersection. Either one of these options is required. And I have an illustration for both these options. So this is for crosswalks at intersections where pedestrian crossing is prohibited. That same requirement applies at crosswalks at mid-block and roundabouts where pedestrian crossing is prohibited. What that looks like is, so the image on the left, you have sidewalk running parallel to Main Street there, but crossing is not allowed across that main street. And you can see where the arrow is pointing. The pedestrian circulation path is separated from the roadway with landscaping. So that's option A. Option B is shown on the image on the right, and that is separating the roadway by a detectable vertical edge treatment with a bottom edge 15 inches maximum above the pedestrian circulation path. So those are the two options that you have if you have a crosswalk where crossing is prohibited. Now, this is not an entirely new requirement. It was discussed in NPRM Advisory R206, pedestrian street crossings, and that advisory language stated, all pedestrian street crossings must be accessible to pedestrians with disabilities. If pedestrian crossing is prohibited at certain locations, no pedestrian crossing signs should be provided along with detectable features such as grass strips, landscaping, planters, chains, fencing, railings, or other barriers. In stating this requirement, what was previously advisory as a rule text, we've offered those two options. So you don't need to separate by landscaping and provide signage and vertical edge treatment. You have to pick one or the other. Let's now look at revisions to roundabout and channelized turn lanes. In the NPRM at R306.3.1 separation, we talked about treatments required where sidewalks are flush against the curb and pedestrian street crossing is not intended. And the provision went on to say a continuous and detectable edge treatment shall be provided along the street side of the sidewalk. And we caution the detectable warning surfaces should not be used for edge treatment. So in the final rule, we broke down that provision from the NPRM into a provision at R306.4.1, edge detection, and two sub-provisions that explain the type of edge detection that's permitted. So one is at R306.4.1.1, separation, and the other is at R306.4.1.2, vertical edge treatment. For edge detection, that's specifically in the final rule at R306.4.1, and it requires that you provide edge detection on the street side of the pedestrian circulation path at the approach and along the circulatory roadway of the roundabout where crossing is not intended. And this overhead image of a roundabout illustrates what this detectable edge looks like. So you can see along the circulatory roadway and where crossing is not intended, there's a vertical, the edge detection is provided. Then we have 306.4.1 separation and 306.4.1.2 vertical edge treatments, specifically those two options. So for separation, where pedestrian circulation path is not intended, is not attached to the curb, landscaping or other non-prepared surface 24 inches wide minimum must be provided. In this illustration, they've done both. They've provided separation with landscaping, at least 2 feet wide, and they've also provided vertical edge treatment. Again, and that's at curb attached pedestrian circulation paths. Continuous and detectable vertical edge treatment must be provided, and the bottom edge must be no more than 15 inches above the pedestrian circulation path. Again, note in this illustration, they've done both. They provided both options, both the separation and the vertical edge treatment. We have expanded crosswalk treatments at roundabout, multi-lane channelized turning lanes to include a traffic control signal with a pedestrian signal head, a pedestrian hybrid beacon, a pedestrian actuated rectangular rapid flashing beacon, or a raised crossing. In the NPRM at R306.4, channelized turn lanes at roundabouts, we required that at roundabouts with pedestrian street crossing, pedestrian activated signals be provided at pedestrian street crossings. In the final rule at R306.4.2 crosswalk treatments, we've expanded the crosswalk treatment types that are acceptable at roundabouts with multi-lane segments. These same treatment options are also seen in crosswalk treatments at channelized turn lanes. So again, in the NPRM, at channelized turn lanes at other signalized intersection, what we required was pedestrian street crossings have pedestrian activated signals. In the final rule, we provide more options. So either a pedestrian signal head, a pedestrian hybrid beacon, a pedestrian actuated rectangular rapid flashing beacon, or a raised crossing. We'll now look at the changes in detectable warning surface requirements. So I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about the fact that we removed advisory language, and one of the places where we removed that advisory language was at detectable warning surfaces at driveways. It is now required, so it's now a standalone provision at R205.7 driveways. Pedestrian circulation paths at driveways controlled with yield or stop control devices or traffic signals shall have detectable warning surfaces complying with R305.2.8. So that is no longer advisory, it is a requirement. We added a definition for pedestrian refuge island. And part of that is to clarify where detectable warning surfaces are required. So the definition of pedestrian refuge island is a defined area 72 inches long minimum in the direction of pedestrian travel, located between traffic lanes for pedestrian refuge within a median, splitter island, or channelizing island. And the reason we define that is to give more clarity, again, to where detectable warning surfaces are required, because we do want that 2-foot separation between the detectable warning surface panels. So in the NPRM, we had at R208.2, where not required, we'd stated that detectable warning surfaces are not required at pedestrian refuge islands that are cut through at street level and are less than 6 feet in length in the direction of pedestrian travel. And there was also accompanying advisory language. So in the final rule, because we've defined pedestrian refuge island, at R305.2.4, pedestrian refuge islands, we require that at cut-through pedestrian refuge islands, again, per the definition, detectable warning surfaces shall be located no greater than 6 inches from the edges of the pedestrian refuge island or at back of curb, and shall be separated by 24 inches minimum length of surface in the direction of travel without detectable warning surfaces. So this just brought more clarity, but the requirement itself didn't really change. Figure R309.2.1 in the NPRM was misleading and caused quite a bit of confusion because it showed detectable warning surfaces at a parallel parking space. And in the final rule, we make it clear that a detectable warning surface is not required on a curb ramp or blended transition that's used exclusively to connect on-street parking access aisles to pedestrian access routes. And this is at R310.5.3, pedestrian access route connection. It gets confusing if you put detectable warning surfaces at curb ramps or blended transitions that exclusively serve on-street parking spaces. It could get confused for a crosswalk. So again, if that curb ramp or blended transition is used exclusively to connect the on-street parking access aisle to pedestrian access routes, you should not be putting detectable warning surfaces there. This requirement also applies at passenger loading zones. So detectable warning surfaces are not required on curb ramps and blended transitions that are used exclusively to connect access aisles to pedestrian access routes. We'll continue on with passenger loading zone requirements that have changed in final rule. We've added a provision limiting obstructions in the space adjacent to passenger loading zones. And you can see an illustration of this on the slide where you have a passenger loading zone, you have the vehicular space, the access aisle, and then we're talking about the center 50% of the adjacent surface. So in the final rule at R311.3.1, we have a provision clearance adjacent to passenger loading zones. The center 50% of the length of sidewalk or adjacent surface, the surface that's adjacent to the inaccessible passenger loading zone needs to be free of obstructions. So no parking meters, no planters. It needs to be completely free and clear of any obstructions. You'll notice in the final rule that we do not require signage at accessible passenger loading zones. In the NPRM, we had at provision 211.4 accessible parking space and passenger loading zone signs. And in part, it stated that at accessible passenger loading zones, you need to have signs. We no longer require signage at accessible passenger loading zones because what we found is that was being mistaken to imply that those passenger loading zones are restricted for accessible use. And we did have the same discussion in the NPRM in advisory 310.1. Again, the advisory pointed to requiring signage, but in the final rule, there's no signage required at accessible passenger loading zones. We did clarify in the final rule that at alternate passenger loading zones, there are some specifications that we scoped. So that's at R204.3 alternate passenger loading zones, where you have a permanently designated passenger loading zone and it's temporarily not accessible due to construction, maintenance operations, or other similar conditions. And a temporary passenger loading zone is provided. That temporary passenger loading zone needs to be accessible. Basically, it needs to comply with R311, which provides technical specifications for accessible passenger loading zones. Next, we'll look at changes in transit stop and transit shelter requirements. We added a provision in scoping requiring that where accessible transit stops are temporarily not accessible due to construction, maintenance operations, or other similar conditions, alternate transit stops complying with R310 must be provided. So if you have a transit stop that is accessible and it's temporarily not accessible, you need to provide an alternate transit stop that is accessible. And R310 provides the technical specifications for accessible transit stops. The final rule requires a connection from the boarding and alighting area and boarding platform to existing pedestrian circulation paths. So in alterations, boarding and alighting areas and boarding platforms need to be connected to existing pedestrian circulation paths by pedestrian access routes. So basically what we don't want to see is a new transit stop or transit shelter essentially placed in the middle of nowhere and it's not connecting to any pedestrian circulation path. If you add a transit shelter or transit stop along your roadway, you want to make sure it's connecting to existing pedestrian circulation path. That could be the nearest curb ramp at the nearest intersection. So you just want to make sure that anything new that you're adding, any transit stops or transit shelters that you're adding or altering are indeed accessible to everyone. In the final rule, we clarified the requirement for environmental controls. So at R309.2.3 environmental controls, where provided, environmental controls within transit shelters need to be proximity actuated. This was previously stated in the NPRM as part of provision R308.2 transit shelters. We do have a new requirement that applies to transit stops and transit shelters, and this is for fare vending machines. Provision R210.2, fare vending machines require that where provided at transit stops and transit shelters, fare vending machines need to be accessible. And for them to be accessible, they need to comply with R403 of PROAG, as well as section 707 of Appendix D to 36 CFR Part 1191, essentially the ADA and ABA accessibility guidelines, with the exception of section 707.2 and 707.3. So again, this new requirement applies where you provide fare vending machines at transit stops and transit shelters. Let's look next at changes in pedestrian signs and pedestrian activated warning devices. So in the NPRM, we had advisory language that is now in an exception in a provision in final rule. In the NPRM at 211.2 pedestrian signs, we required that signs other than transit signs provide directions, warning, or other information for pedestrians only shall comply with 410. We also had a provision for transit signs at 211.3, stating that signs that identify routes served by transit stops shall comply with R410. And R410 in the NPRM and in the final rule gives you the technical requirements for these signs. What we had in the NPRM in advisory R211.3 is that transit schedules, timetables, and maps are not required to comply with R410. So we've now taken that advisory language and it's an exception in the final rule. So final rule R208.1 is what gets you the requirement that signs intended solely for pedestrians, including transit signs, and all signs serving shared use paths must comply with R410. So the thing to note is we're saying that signs intended solely for pedestrians, including transit signs, must be accessible. But then we also say, and all signs at shared use paths. So we recognize that all signs at shared use paths may not be intended for pedestrians. So maybe there might be a sign for bicyclists telling them how fast they should go, or some other user other than pedestrians. So when it comes to shared use paths, all signs need to be accessible. In the exception is where we address transit schedules, timetables, and maps. Those are not required to comply. We've also added signs mounted immediately above or incorporated into a push button detector unit are not required to comply. So those are signs you'll see above the push button that tell you how to operate it essentially. If we require those to comply with the signage requirements in R410, it would be really huge signs. So those are exempt as well. Pedestrian activated warning devices such as rectangular rapid flashing beacons do not stop traffic. Rather, they provide flashing lights that draw drivers' attention to the crosswalk to warn them of the presence of pedestrians. So because these devices do not stop traffic, there is no walk interval, and thus no audible or vibrotactile walk indication. And we've specified that in R307.7, audible and vibrotactile indication for pedestrian activated warning devices without a walk indication. And so we're saying where a pedestrian push button or passive detection device is provided for pedestrian activated warning devices, such as RRFBs, the PED push button or the passive detection device must activate a speech message that indicates the status of the beacon instead of an audible walk indication. Where a pedestrian push button is provided, it should not include vibrotactile features indicating a walk interval. Now on to on-street parking. First, in scoping for on-street parking, we've added exceptions to clarify what is covered and what is not covered. The exceptions are on-street parking spaces designated exclusively as residential parking are not required to comply with 211. And so you don't need to count those for the purpose of scoping accessible parking. On-street parking spaces designated exclusively for commercial or law enforcement vehicles are not required to comply with R211. And again, they don't need to be counted for the purpose of determining accessible parking requirements. And lastly, where on-street parking spaces are altered, the requirements of R211 shall apply only to the affected parking spaces until the minimum number of accessible on-street parking spaces as specified in Table R211 are provided. In terms of parking that's not on a block perimeter, in the NPRM, we didn't explicitly address parking that's not on a block perimeter. So what we did in final rule is specify at R211.3 with a provision for parking not on a block perimeter, which states where parking spaces are provided on a section of a street that is not part of a block perimeter, accessible parking spaces complying with R310 must be provided in accordance with Table 211. Where parking is metered or designated by signs or pavement markings, but individual spaces are not marked, each 20 feet of street where parking is designated must be counted as one parking space. So we just wanted to make sure we closed that gap because we recognize that in the public right-of-way, all on-street parking is not necessarily on a block perimeter. So that's what this provision is intended to capture, on-street parking that is not on a block perimeter. We have added a definition for block perimeter because we found in technical assistance that that was always a source of confusion. We've revised the requirements for parallel on-street parking spaces. So in final rule, we specify at R310.2.1 dimensions for a parallel on-street parking space. So they shall be 24 feet long minimum and 13 feet wide minimum, and they should not encroach on the traveled way. So these dimensions take into account both the vehicle space and what was referred to in the NPRM as an access aisle. So even though we don't use the language access aisle for a parallel on-street parking space in the final rule, when you take the dimension that we have specified, it accounts for both the vehicle space and a 5-foot essentially access aisle, but we're just looking at it as one big space. In the NPRM, we only specified dimensions for the access aisle. This provision is in the NPRM was at R309.2.1.1 alterations, and that's alterations to on-street parking. And it's essentially the same as this is the same provision in the NPRM as it is in final rule. It's just stated differently. So in NPRM R309.2.1.1 alterations, we required that in alterations where the street or sidewalk adjacent to the parking space is not altered, an access aisle shall not be required, provided that that parking space is placed at the end of the block face. What we did in final rule at R310.2.1, we provided an exception to the dimensions that I mentioned in the previous slide. So the first exception, where parallel on-street parking spaces are altered, but the adjacent pedestrian circulation path is not, any accessible parallel on-street parking spaces that are provided may have the same dimensions as your standard adjacent parallel on-street parking space if they're provided nearest the crosswalk at the end of the block face. And notice we added or nearest a mid-block crosswalk, and a curb ramp or blended transition is provided serving that crosswalk. So if you don't have the space similar to the NPRM discussion for alterations, then you need to make sure you put that accessible parking space either at the end of the block face where there's a curb ramp or blended transition, or you can put it nearest a mid-block crosswalk that has a curb ramp or blended transition. In the NPRM, we had provision R309.2.2 that addressed specifically narrow sidewalks. And this provision is stated as exception 2 in the final rule. Again, it's an exception to the dimensions that I mentioned. So in the NPRM, an access aisle was not required where the width of the adjacent sidewalk or available right-of-way was less than 14 feet. And again, in that case, you locate the accessible parking space at the end of the block face. So in the final rule, again, we just stated it differently. In alterations where providing parallel on-street parking spaces with the dimensions specified would result in an available right-of-way width less than or equal to 9 feet measured from the curb line to the right-of-way line. The accessible parallel on-street parking space may have the same dimension as adjacent parallel on-street parking spaces if that accessible on-street parking space is provided nearest the crosswalk at the end of the block face or nearest a mid-block crosswalk, and there is a curb ramp or blended transition serving that crosswalk. We clarified the requirement for connecting parallel parking spaces to pedestrian access routes. So in final rule in R310.2.2, pedestrian access route connection, that was always a requirement to connect that access aisle to the pedestrian circulation path. In the final rule, we specify that where you have 2 or more accessible parallel on-street parking spaces that are adjacent to each other, each accessible parallel on-street parking space needs to have its own connection to the pedestrian access route. So you have 2 on-street parallel parking spaces that are accessible and adjacent to each other. One shouldn't have to traverse the accessible space next to them in order to get onto the pedestrian access route. So each one of those spaces needs to have its own connection to the pedestrian access route. We added vehicle space dimensioning for angled on-street parking. In the NPRM, we only specified the width of the access aisle, and that was at R309.3. And we also allowed 2 parking spaces to share an access aisle. Again, this is for angled on-street parking spaces. In the final rule, we have specified a width for angled parking spaces, and that is 132 inches. We've also specified in R310.4.2, which is a change in the NPRM, in terms of the access aisle. In the final rule, we state that each angled on-street parking space must have an adjacent access aisle 5 inches minimum wide, extending the full length of the parking space. And the access aisle should be placed on the passenger side. This requirement is similar to the one I discussed on passenger loading zones, accessible passenger loading zones specifically. So similarly at on-street parallel parking space, we want that center 50% of surface or sidewalk that's adjacent to the accessible on-street parallel parking space to be completely clear. No street furniture, no landscaping. It needs to be completely clear for use for the person using this accessible parking space. At R310.2.4, clearance adjacent to parking spaces, which states the center 50% of the length of the sidewalk or other surface adjacent to an accessible parallel parking space shall be free of obstructions, including parking identification signs, parking pay meters, and parking pay stations. And this center 50% needs to comply with the requirements in R302.6. So the clearance adjacent to parking spaces, we had addressed this in the NPRM in advisory language specifically. And that was discussed at R309.2 parallel parking spaces. In the NPRM advisory, we stated that the sidewalk adjacent to accessible parallel parking spaces should be free of signs, street furniture, and other obstructions to permit deployment of a van side lift or ramp or the vehicle occupant to transfer to a wheelchair or scooter. Accessible parallel parking spaces located at the end of the block face are usable by vans that have rear lifts and cars that have scooter platforms. So that's essentially what is now R310.2.4 clearance adjacent to parking spaces. this requirement was previously discussed in an advisory. In the final rule, we have specified the cross slope of pedestrian access routes contained within a crosswalk, and they are separate sub-provisions. The requirement is still the same. So in the final rule at R302.5, and we have provisions under that, 2.1, which is yield or stop control devices, 2.2, uncontrolled approaches, 2.3, traffic control signal or pedestrian hybrid beacon, 2.4, mid-block and roundabout crosswalks. And the requirements are the same as what we articulated in NPRM R302.6. These requirements for cross slopes are dependent on the location of the crosswalk. With yield or stop control, we allow for 2.1% max. At an uncontrolled approach, we allow for 5% max. Traffic control signal or pedestrian hybrid beacon, we allow up to 5% cross slope at the crosswalk. And if your crosswalk is at mid-block or a roundabout, then the cross slope can be no greater than the street grade. A new clarification we added addressed a frequently asked question in technical assistance, because in the NPRM we had specific cross slope requirements for the pedestrian access route. So now you have a pedestrian access route that's not within a crosswalk. And in this image, we show an illustration of that. So in this image, you have an on-street parallel parking space, an accessible parallel parking space. It doesn't have an aisle, so that's why it's located as the last one at the end of a block or nearest the mid-block crossing. And so you technically have a pedestrian access path, a pedestrian access route from the vehicle exit, going through the vehicular way to the crosswalk and the curb ramp or blended transition. And so R302.5.1, not contained within a crosswalk, we're specifying that the cross slope of this pedestrian access route that's not within the crosswalk shall be 2.1% maximum, but the exception is what specifically addresses this pedestrian access route that's essentially in the vehicular way. And the exception says the portion of a pedestrian access route within a street that connects an accessible parallel on-street parking space to the nearest crosswalk at the end of the block face or the nearest mid-block crosswalk is not required to have a maximum cross slope of 1 in 48. So again, this exception serves to the concern of the pedestrian access route from the vehicle to the crosswalk and onto the curb ramp. The last changes we'll look at are those that pertain to ramps and stairs. So for ramps, one of the things we did, and I think I mentioned this earlier, is there had been quite a bit of confusion based on the technical assistance that we offer, where users were confusing the requirements for curb ramp and the requirements for ramps. In the final rule, we made sure we articulated where to go for curb ramp technical requirements versus ramp technical requirements. So for a ramp, there is a minimum clear width at R407.4. The clear width of a ramp run must be 48 inches minimum. Where handrails are provided, the clear width between the handrails must be 48 inches minimum. There is an exception. So if that ramp only serves a building entrance, the clear width of the ramp run can be 36 inches minimum, which is consistent with the building guidelines. Where the handrails are provided, the clear width between handrails can be 36 inches minimum. So the clear width of your ramp is going to be based on what it serves. If it's only serving a building entrance, you can follow the building guidelines, which is 36 inches. Otherwise, it needs to be 48 inches minimum. And where you provide handrails, you're measuring that width from handrail to handrail. We do have a new requirement. We had a lot of commenters requesting this requirement, and this is for visual contrast at stairs. Visual contrast, the leading edge of each step tread and top landing must be marked by a stripe. The stripe must be 1 inch wide minimum and contrast visually with the rest of the step tread or circulation path surface, either light on dark or dark on light. And you can see in this picture, you have that visual contrast at the step tread and top landing. This requirement is in Chapter 4 of the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines. This concludes the changes to the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines. I noted changes from the NPRM to the final rule. If you have any questions on this training, you can reach us at ROW@access-board.gov.